the Belgian Grand Prix this weekend, which means that thousands of people dressed in orange will be heading to a forest to cheer on their favourite driver, Lando Norris. Well, I mean, he is part Belgian, so technically, but there's a certain magic about Spa. It's one of the 4 most historic circuits in Formula 1 and actually one of the most historic circuits in racing full stop. The others being Monaco, Le Mans, Indianapolis, Silverstone and Monza. Okay, Silverstone is the youngest of all of those circuits by some margin, but it's where the Formula 1 World Championship began, so, well, it's got that going for it, I suppose. But the winding ribbon of tarmac that goes through the Ardennes forest, even if it is shaped a bit like a fully automatic pistol, is loved by drivers and fans alike. And gamers. Want to guarantee a full grid? GT3 and Spa. The end of the world could be happening outside and people will still be racing it. But that magic is still in the air. At least, I'm told that it's still in the air. I've never been to Spa, and I'd love to go, but I've been to Silverstone a number of times, and there's this aura of being in a place surrounded by history. That on this particular track, Spa that is, the likes of Fangio, Moss, Graham Hill, Jack Brabham, Jackie Ickx, Jim Clark, all the way up to Senna, Schumacher and everybody else have been on it. With the latter drivers racing on a track that's completely different to the one that was used in the 50s and 60s. And I think that's what makes Spa what it is. Again, I can only speak for our once bomber airfield of a home circuit, but you go there and you look at certain corners or certain sections of the track, and while it's been upgraded to a state-of-the-art facility, with Spa also getting some pretty big upgrades in the last 2 or 3 years, it's like the history has been trapped within, and you get this weird feeling. That feeling of, stuff happened here, and it was awesome. I guess it's because tracks like Spa, Monza, Silverstone, Le Mans, Indianapolis and so on were built so long ago and then updated and upgraded as time went on. Like the older football stadiums in England like Old Trafford, Craven Cottage, Anfield, the City Ground, St James's Park have all been upgraded over the years. Or in America you've got the old baseball stadiums that are still on the site they were on in the early 20th century, and they've also been built on and built on and built on. The history is preserved and then continued. Put simply, you won't get that with a soulless new build stadium like Tottenham Hotspur's ground or Brighton's ground or something like that, in the same way you won't get it from a more modern circuit like Abu Dhabi. With the old stadiums and circuits, everything's been built on and improved and everything's been shoehorned in on top of what was already there. The new stadiums and the new circuits are built with all the modern amenities already built in. There's really nothing to update and it's just the same, if you follow me. So when it was announced last year that the Belgian Grand Prix was going to be going on rotation, something I covered as part of the current affairs side of the channel, it caused uproar. Because this is Spa. You don't do that to Spa of all places simply because it's regarded as being the best racetrack in the world. Although that's all going to be down to personal opinion, because I would say that Bathurst is the greatest racetrack in the world and I'd list Bathurst ahead of Spa and even the Nordschleife. Or Nordschleife, more like. Look, James May was right, and you know he was. The whole, if I was in Bomber Command in 1943, etc. But to keep things serious for a second, the Belgian Grand Prix will be going on rotation. In 2028 and 2030, the event will drop off the calendar, but there will still be a Belgian Grand Prix in 2026, 27, 29 and 31. And 2031 is when the contract runs out. So we're still getting 4 races at Spa in 6 years. It's not like it's dropping off for an extended period of time or going on alternate years like Hockenheim did or something like that. But people were saying that it shouldn't have to go on rotation and that there should be some sort of protection for the older, more historic races. Maybe having the Monaco, British, Italian and Belgian Grand Prix as crown jewel events and everything else moves around instead. Others said that no race was more important than the sport, and if Formula 1 wants to be a true world championship, you have to have more races outside of the European homeland. But I'll leave that to you to have a debate about. But what if I was to tell you that the only 2 Grand Prix in Formula 1 history that have been ever present are the British and Italian Grand Prix? We think of the Belgian Grand Prix as being this ever-present round of the World Championship, but it has dropped off in certain years, and it's dropped off twice in the last 25 years, and it dropped off before that as well. Why? Here's why. It's actually true that the Belgian Grand Prix isn't as ever-present as you'd think. The history buffs among you will already know that Spa dropped off for a little bit because of the upgrades being made to the circuit towards the end of the 1960s, but there was still a Belgian Grand Prix, and it had a couple of other homes. The main one being at Zolder, but there were a couple of attempts at running the race elsewhere. The circuit of Nivelles, near Brussels. Nivelle didn't work out and it found its temporary home, or its exile if you will, at Zolder, and then returned to Spa in 1984. Yeah, it took them almost 15 years to go back. If you've been watching the channel for a while, you'll know that it was all done on safety grounds, and I think I've covered this particular story more times than I've covered option 13, and that's saying something. When talking about the safety stuff, this bit always gets mentioned because it was such an important part of that part of racing history. The average lap speed in 1968 was around 150 miles an hour, and in 1969 the GPDA refused to race when the organisers did their usual slow down if you don't like it thing. The track was just public roads, with no barriers whatsoever. The only things to stop you if you went off were telegraph poles, or worse still, houses. One final race was held in 1970 with a chicane at Stavelot to slow the cars down, but then they binned it off altogether. And this was not well received at the time. Jackie Stewart got all the hate mail because it was him leading the crusade, with Dennis Jenkinson, who was working for the Times, writing a piece on how it was all disgraceful. Much like how people were up in arms about Spa going on rotation in 2024, they were up in arms about it coming off the calendar in 1970 as well. The thinking was, they'll never boycott Spa, it's too much of an important event to do that, same with the Nürburgring. But they did. But just over a decade before the pious little Scot with beady eyes decided to stick it to all the circuit owners, the race was cancelled due to political reasons, and not for the first time, as we'll see in a bit. In 1956, the year my dad was born come to think of it, the Suez Crisis happened. Long story short, this was a bit of a shambles. Britain and France launched a military operation to take back the Suez Canal that forms a shortcut between the Mediterranean and Red Sea, and shortens the time that it takes to get from Europe to Asia by, yes, amount. Unless a giant ship gets stuck in it, obviously. Egypt had nationalised the canal, but the British and French owned the canal and had done since it was built in 1869. So the British and French invaded Egypt and occupied Port Said, the northern end of the canal. But the rest of the world didn't see things the way that Britain and France did. The Americans said, "Hey, you can't do that," and the only member of the British Commonwealth that backed the operation was Australia, and Pakistan threatened to leave the Commonwealth if things continued. The pressure from the Commonwealth piled up, the Soviets called it another instance of British imperialism, and after the UN stepped in, the British and French gave up and went home. But it wasn't as simple as that, because this military operation had a massive knock-on effect for Formula 1 over the next 12 months. Fuel prices shot up in the wake of the crisis, this being because fuel wasn't getting up the canal from the Middle East up to Europe, and because there was low supply and high demand, the economics went the way they did. Because Formula 1 cars used a lot of fuel in those days, and teams didn't have sponsorship money to fall back on, only the starting money and prize money from other races, it was becoming difficult for some organisers to put the Grand Prix on. In Belgium and the Netherlands, fuel prices shot up so much that the organisers had very little money to give to the teams, so both the Dutch and Belgian Grand Prix were cancelled in 1957. I've explained this concept before with regards to starting money, but I'll explain it again just in case you're new to the channel and this is the first time you've heard my voice and seen my moon-sized head. In the era before sponsorship, starting money was how the teams made their money, as well as taking prize money from the race's prize pots. Grand Prix translating to big prize when you translate it from French to English, hence the name. Starting money was essentially an appearance fee. The big teams and drivers got paid more, the guys down the lower end of the grid got paid less. And this would change from circuit to circuit and country to country. At the Italian Grand Prix, for instance, the Ferrari team would likely be paid the most because they were the number one draw. Likewise, at Silverstone, Stirling Moss might have got the most, or at least the team he drove for might get the most. It's estimated that at the 1958 Morocco Grand Prix at Casablanca, Moss earned a combined £900 for that one race, with £384 of those pounds being the starting money. It doesn't sound like much now, but back then, that was the equivalent of £18,000, and £18,000 went a lot further back then. And the whole business surrounding starting money and the Belgian Grand Prix came back round again in 1959. Motorsport magazine wrote in the report for the 1960 event, an event I do need to cover at some point because it was essentially the Imola 1994 of the time, that it was financial wrangling. It looked like it stemmed from the organisers not paying the teams what they thought they were worth. But in 2003, politics cancelled the Belgian Grand Prix again, and it involved the one thing that connected virtually all of the teams on the grid: tobacco. Formula 1 today is completely different to how it was when I was a kid. Most of the teams were connected to a tobacco company in some way in 1999, and if it wasn't a title sponsorship, then the drivers usually had sponsorship at a lower level, usually from Marlboro. In 1999, Ferrari, McLaren, Williams, Prost, BAR, Benetton and Jordan all had title sponsorship from a tobacco brand. And as a result, we had colour left, right and centre, with the Jordan cars becoming cult icons for the Benson and Hedges schemes. So to show you how much the tobacco companies had invested in the sport, in 1999, just before Williams teamed up with BMW and went full tech bro, McLaren were partnered with West, Ferrari with Marlboro. Williams had Winfield logos on the car at the insistence of Rothmans, while Jordan had the famous Benson and Hedges Hornet livery. Prost had backing from French tobacco brand Gaulois, and they were given exceptions from the French government and Evans law because reasons, and then you had Benetton with Mild 7 and BAR being owned by a tobacco company. So BAR definitely had a vested interest in any country banning these logos. Stewart, Arrows, Sauber and Minardi were the teams without tobacco logos in 1999. Although one of the Minardi drivers might have had a small Marlboro logo on his race suit. The teams with tobacco sponsorship ran the full liveries at every race except the British, French, German and Belgian Grand Prix of 1999. Although in 2000 the logos came back for the Belgian Grand Prix, as shown in the iconic shots of Hakkinen and the Michael double teaming Ricardo Zonta, who was also carrying tobacco logos on his BAR. I think in 1999 there had been threats of cancellation in Belgium over the tobacco advertising rules, but it all got resolved. But the whole situation around the turn of the century was just weird. But the thing is, Eddie Jordan would not have been able to sign Damon Hill without the Benson and Hedges money, because the money would have not been there otherwise, even if the way that Benson and Hedges got that money was, well, a bit unethical. But for the teams, it was a lifeline. Yes, it was unethical, but it was effectively a bottomless pit of cash. But there was a growing problem. As time went on and on, governments were starting to implement strict anti-tobacco laws, but sports tended to be an exception, with Australia being one such location. Britain meanwhile banned tobacco advertising in 1963, just after the Italians banned tobacco advertising in 1962. The French brought in Evans law in the early 90s that saw a complete ban on any tobacco and alcohol advertising, including sports. Britain meanwhile was in a bit of a weird spot. Formula 1 couldn't have tobacco logos on the cars, but the Snooker World Championship and the Masters events were sponsored by Embassy and Benson and Hedges respectively. And this wasn't just a Britain thing, but it was happening in other countries as well. I've also done a video of the time Bernie Ecclestone donated £1 million to the Labour Party in 1997, because Labour had won the election in 1997 taking over from the Conservatives, and it was seen at the time as Bernie trying to sweeten the deal with the new government, because there was the thinking that a broadcast in, say, I don't know, Japan, where tobacco advertising was completely legal and they could have Mild 7, Benson and Hedges, Marlboro logos on the cars, would actually be illegal in Britain, because they were showing the logos even though the race was happening in another country. But it wasn't just France and Britain, because Germany had joined in with the whole no tobacco advertising thing as well. And as we headed into the new millennium, the anti-smoking thing would be picking up steam, and it would only be a few years before tobacco advertising pretty much disappeared from racing altogether. The European Union was also looking at bringing in union-wide bans, even though Britain, France, Italy and Germany already had their own, although Italy still allowed the logos for Formula 1 races. You might have noticed that F1 games from the late 90s usually had the tobacco liveries done as they appeared at the French Grand Prix, because they were usually the strictest in terms of censorship. In December 2002, the European Union's health ministers voted to approve new anti-smoking legislation that would ban all tobacco sponsorship of sporting events in Europe after the 31st of July 2005. But at the same time, the Belgian government had voted through their own legislation that would have seen the tobacco bans come in a little earlier, the start of August in 2003. The Belgian Grand Prix would have been at the end of August on the 31st, so in response, the teams voted at the end of 2002 to not go to Belgium in 2003, angered that the Belgians were going to bring in these tobacco advertising bans when the EU was going to ban it anyway. And this caused a bit of chaos behind the scenes. Bernie said that all Belgium had to do was adopt the same position the Germans had taken, which was to ban tobacco in 2006. And the motorsport media was confused because the teams simply took the logos off for other races, like in France and Britain. So why was Belgium any different? And the local businesses in the Spa-Francorchamps area were also a bit hacked off because they relied on the Grand Prix for revenue. Like mentioned, governments were making certain exceptions for sporting events because of the revenue that they were bringing in. The EU was banning the sponsorship of sporting events, while sponsoring of the cars and the censorship of those adverts was done on a country-by-country basis. At the German and British Grand Prix of 1998, for instance, the McLarens ran a logo that wasn't the West logo on the cars. It was like a man and a star, I think, while at the French Grand Prix, where the laws were even stricter, the side pods and rear wings were completely blank. Ferrari, meanwhile, didn't run their famous barcode livery, but instead blanked out the Marlboro logos entirely, leaving white boxes on the engine covers. The British government, meanwhile, didn't like these new laws because they wanted to stay out of the way of the tobacco companies, while the Germans wanted the laws to be even stricter. What's interesting is that later on in 1998 at the Nürburgring, the McLarens, the Ferraris, the Jordans, the Prosts and so on were allowed to run full tobacco liveries, even though they were still racing in Germany. They had censored liveries at Hockenheim, but the full liveries at the Nürburgring. Was it because it was the Luxembourg Grand Prix and therefore didn't have to comply with the same laws? I don't know. It might have been a state thing in Germany, I'm not sure, but that's one for you to discuss in the comments. At least, if you know the answer anyway. But Bernie cancelling the Grand Prix did force the Belgian government to reconsider things. Bernie had managed to make the Belgian government realise that what they had was too important to lose completely, especially with Formula 1 now making inroads into China and the Middle East, with Bahrain and Shanghai coming in for 2004 and also Turkey coming soon after. And this happened after the Austrian Grand Prix had already been dropped for 2004 as a result of tobacco bans. With limited slots on the calendar, especially with the races in China and the Middle East coming, and the Austrian Grand Prix dropped for having similar laws, the Belgians needed to get their race back, and they went back to Parliament to start getting things through, and they started voting again. In the July of 2003, the Belgian Senate started modifying the terms and conditions of their anti-tobacco law, which had been in the works since 1997. Senator Jean-Marie Happart took the proposals to the Social Affairs Commission of the Senate, and it passed through by 9 votes to 4, with 4 members abstaining. As a result of this, the tobacco ban in Belgium was now delayed. It wouldn't come in for the August of 2003, but on the same day that the EU's ban would come in, that being the 31st of July 2005. So as a reward for postponing the bans, Bernie gave the Belgians their race back for 2004, and Formula 1 committed to their own tobacco ban for 2007. Although during 2007 and 2008 we still saw Marlboro logos on the Ferraris, so yeah, I've got no clue what that was all about. And we always talk about Formula 1 being political. Whether it's a team principal accusing others of cheating, another team threatening to pull out when the rules aren't bent to serve that team better, or even a driver pulling some strings to get some favourable treatment because he wants to have all the best gear. But we forget sometimes that actual politics can get in the way as well. But it's a bit confusing, all the same, because several races were already run without tobacco logos, so why was this one worse than the others? But I'll leave that to you to try and decipher, because the whole tobacco thing in the early 2000s was a bit strange. But we have the Belgian Grand Prix back, for now. But what's going to happen after the contract runs out? We live in hope that something will work out, because like the British Grand Prix, the Belgian Grand Prix is somehow always in trouble, only to always be saved. But we'll just have to wait and see. So then, a look at a couple of times when the Belgian Grand Prix wasn't on the calendar, even though we consider it to be one of the ever-present races along with the British and Italian Grand Prix. If this has been an interesting look through the motorsport history books, then do give the video a like so I know I've done a good job. And for more stuff from this channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads over at Patreon for the continued support. And if you want to help keep the lights on or help with image purchases, there'll be a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and bobs you might want or need to know. Or the super thanks for any one and done donations and memberships so you can Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.